Good afternoon and welcome to SnapTech IT's monthly webinar. My name is Ted Holstein. I'm Chief Revenue Officer for SnapTech IT and your host for today's event. Thanks for joining in for the live session. This webinar will be recorded and circulated to all registrants. We encourage everyone who's joining us live to ask us questions as we go along. The topic for today is CMMC Back to Basics, 7 Tips for Manufacturing Leaders. Today, I'm joined by Carl Bickmore, co-founder and CEO of SnapTech IT. Carl, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks, Ted. Glad to be here. It's exciting to get back to the basics here. There's been a lot of stuff going on around CMMC, and so I think sometimes it's good to just recenter on what we think is important to know.
That's right. I mean, that was kind of the genesis of this webinar. We every month have tons of interactions with manufacturers and have questions that we get all the time, and there's lots of folks who are at different stages of this journey in terms of figuring out what CMMC means for their business. And we thought we would do a session where we just kind of take it back to basics. And so that's kind of the agenda for today. Let's look at it. I think we're going to start the conversation off with the why of CMMC. Like, why does the Department of Defense, why does the federal government care so much about cybersecurity maturity, and protecting the defense industrial base? We'll get into that. And then we'll talk about CMMC 2.0. Why is it 2.0? When did it become 2.0? What does it mean? How has that impacted things? And then we'll get into 7 very practical next steps that everybody who's tuning into this session can really get busy just executing today. Like, what are some steps you can and progress you can make in your business and with your leadership team in your organization? So before we get into the meat of the content, we always like to just take a moment and explain a little bit about who we are, if there's anybody kind of new on the webinar who doesn't know us. But we are a security-first managed service provider with operations in Atlanta, Georgia, Phoenix, Arizona, and San Francisco, California. We serve clients in 2 different ways. For organizations that you would generally consider kind of small and medium-sized organizations, we provide fully managed IT services. So this would be companies that don't have anybody on staff who has an IT badge, and they really look to us to do everything for them on their technology and IT front. So that's what we would consider kind of fully managed IT. And then we also supply what we call co-managed IT for larger organizations that have maybe a single IT director or an IT manager or maybe even a team. We supplement what they do. Those sorts of organizations often have a lot of different challenges with growth and managing all the complexity around, especially cybersecurity today. And we also support organizations with a co-managed IT service format as well. So that's a little bit about us. Carl, why don't we start things off and just talk a little bit about the why of CMMC? What are we worried about? What is the federal government worried about? What are we trying to get accomplished with this compliance framework?
Yeah, look, I think it's just a recognition and perhaps maybe a slow and a little bit behind the times recognition when we look at what's going on out there in the IT space, but a recognition that it's not just enough to go to the prime subcontractors, the Boeings and the Northrop Grummons, the Raytheons of the world, and to say, please do a good job with your security. There's a real recognition that their supply chain, which are the subcontractors, the first tier and the second and third tier subcontractors that all get involved, also have a role to play. And to be perfectly frank, most of them, this has not been a big part of what they do and not been a focus. And technology is oftentimes behind the times or using very old methodologies in these organizations, and it's posing a significant risk to our nation, our very own infrastructure. We've seen lots of instances of this where there have been hacks that have affected major things like the gasoline pipeline a couple of years ago in the eastern United States. But this is also a recognition that if we don't do a good job with this, this provides an advantage or an opportunity for folks that wish to do us ill to use this information against us, if you will. And so this began with an executive order back in the 2012 timeframe with President Obama. It became law in 2016, and then people just didn't know what to do about it. And so they created this program to help people have a more clear understanding of what the expectation of the subcontractors or just anybody working within the defense industrial base or just the federal government space, that they began to make a more clear understanding of what it is that they would like you to do in order to be more secure and more protective of this critical information that we don't want to get into the hands of people who would wish us ill.
That's right. And I mean, I think the example we have here is there's a lot of chatter and press stories about, you know, allegations that some of our adversaries, like potentially the Chinese, you know, have in the past stolen meaningful amounts of intellectual property from the defense industrial base. And, you know, the Chinese J-20 stealth bomber is believed to be a pretty legit knockoff of the, you know, American technology, right? That's in there, you know, and so it's a pretty glaring example. I mean, we have the pictures there. You can read some of these news stories about it, but it's pretty real. You know, some of the things that have happened over the years where very real secrets have been stolen by adversaries and incorporated into their technology. And when it comes to defense matters, that's a really huge problem. So let's talk a little bit about, change gears and talk about CMMC 2.0. Why the 2.0? What happened? When did it happen? What does it mean?
Well, I think this is just an example of the organizations involved churning through and coming up with ideas and then coming up with improvements to those ideas, if you will. And I do see the newer version or the current version that we call the 2.0 version as an improvement because it's simpler and clarifies in an easier way. Previously, when the CMMC model was first being created, it leveraged much of the NIST 800-171, which is the federal subcontractor guideline that's been around for a while. Of course, it gets revised and whatnot, but it's a standard that's been established and known for a long time. It leveraged that, and then it also added additional controls and some additional things. And frankly, you know, as people began really looking hard at what it takes to get involved with these things and to follow these things, it just became evident that there wasn't a lot of practical reason, at least this is my interpretation, it wasn't a practical reason for 5 levels. There was really folks that had some basic hygienes that were needed. There were folks that had controlled and classified information that was a different level that required a lot more. And then there was the beyond the controlled and classified into top secret or other areas that would require an even deeper level. And so I feel like, you know, I remember back in the day when we were talking to folks about the version 1, it was really hard to distinguish. It felt like nobody we talked to would ever make sense that we would talk to them about level 2 or 4. And essentially they just got removed. And so what was level 5 is now level 3, and what was level 3 is now level 2, and level 1 pretty much stayed the same, which makes a lot of sense. But now it's 100% aligned with the NIST practice as well, which has the benefit of being more established and more understood, and yet still pretty reasonably comprehensive. And so this has been a way to simplify and make it more easily understood, easier to follow, easier to assess, and easier to understand the various controls that are out there. And so in my mind, it was simply a simplification, and it practically, from a meaningful sense, didn't change people's targets very much, because most people were previously targeting level 1, 3, or 5, and now it's the same 1, 2, and 3 are those same levels.
I guess, Carl, one thing that was pretty significant, however, was that level 2 companies that are at level 2 today and are on select programs can potentially self-attest, you know, for years, self-attest to their level of compliance rather than requiring a third-party assessor to come in.
Yeah, really great point. And self-assessment is an interesting thing. It doesn't mean that you have the in-house skill set, so now you just start answering the questionnaires. You really still need to understand the methodology, know the controls, and know how to answer them. And there has, you know, it just means that you can use a wider group of professionals or organizations to assist you in that assessment. But ultimately, it's you can do it without having without the requirement of engaging one of the certified third-party assessors or C3PAOs, as they call organizations, to do a specific CMMC attestation for your organization. And that's a good thing, because it really looks like there's not going to be anywhere near enough of those C3 PAO organizations around to meet the demand. And so there's probably a practical nature to this, I would assume. But it also means that organizations can take this into their own hands, get a good report done correctly, answered correctly, provide it to their prime contractors, and really be able to move forward and participate in those contracts that are going to be restricted to certain levels going forward. And so this means it's a little less cumbersome than it was before, but the requirements are still fundamentally similar, and you still need to have the expertise and ability to answer the questions and score them correctly.
Okay, and let's kind of go just one level deeper here and just work our way up. What is a level 1 organization? What kind of information do they have, and what kind of controls or practices do they need to have? And then let's move to 2 and then to 3.
Yeah, I think the key thing, I think there's a term I think is thrown around a lot for level 1. This is called basic hygiene. And I would argue that these controls apply to any business in any industry and are the fundamentals of like general basics that you should do to protect your organization's IT systems and to keep them free from potential attackers that might look to do a ransomware event or a business email compromise and try to do fraudulent wire transfers, whatever the thing is that they're going for. But those are really, really common things that happen. And so those level 1 practices really get down to the brass tacks of some of the very, very basic things that really any organization should do. And typically, you know, if you're somehow involved in the defense industrial base somewhere as a subcontractor or related somehow, level 1 might be all that you need if you do not have any controlled unclassified information. And so simply being a subcontractor of an organization that participates in that area of the federal government could mean that you need to do at least level 1. A lot of times, all you might have is federal contract information, or FCI. And that's simply just that, you know, you have the details of a federal contract that you're now participating in. And that's considered level 1 required. Really just participating as any kind of subcontractor, that's the base understanding. And frankly, that's not the hardest, most time-consuming assessment to get done, to check and see where you're at. And the barrier to getting to those 17 practices is, you know, it might be bigger for some than others, but it's not near the event that it takes to get to the level 2 or level 3, which is to say there's a really big difference between level 1 and level 2 as we go from 17 controls to 110, and that's spread into much wider areas, if that makes sense. So that's the basic of level 1, fundamental hygiene that generally applies anywhere. And you may or may not be doing some of those practices already. The federal contract information is a clue that if that's all you have as far as governmental information, that you might be level 1 only.
Right. And then if you have controlled and classified information, that moves you up to level 2. And then what's that mean?
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand, because I see a lot of confusion of people looking at this, like trying to determine, hey, should I be level 1, level 2, level 3? I can't tell. Some don't know what the definition of controlled and classified information is. You know, for a lot of manufacturers, you know, who we were thinking about a lot for this webinar, because that's who we tend to work with a lot in this area. It can be just as simple as the drawings that you have for the parts that you're producing, right? And oftentimes well, I would say, you know, pretty regular or consistently, your prime contractor or whoever you're contracting with, or even with the federal government, will let you know if they think what you're dealing with is controlled and classified information. So if you have concern about what information you may come across on a particular contract that you're bidding on or that you're working on, they usually can clarify that for you. But you'd be surprised, some things you might consider relatively benign might be considered controlled unclassified information. And then that puts you into the arena where you need to account for 110 controls, which include all of the things in level 1, and then a lot more detail and a lot of additional controls around things that you might need to do in your cybersecurity. So, you know, the days of just having a firewall and a backup and an antivirus and you're good to go are kind of not what this is. This is all about policies, procedures. It's a control system, just like many of you are doing with many other control systems that you report to for your manufacturing clearances or other organizations you participate in for standards, so you can claim the ability to produce at a certain level. ISO standards or AIS or NIDA, there's these different ones that you have that this is similar. You should be thinking of it similarly. There's policies, there's controls to write, and there's auditing of it to be done. And then there's the controls themselves that you actually need to make sure you've implemented systems and solutions for. And then I would say the fundamental difference between a level 2 and a level 3 has to do with the sensitive nature of the controlled unclassified or additionally controlled information that you might have access to. And in that scenario, you are expected to use a C3PAO organization formally, and you have not only the controls of level 1 and level 2, but some additional ones coming from the 800-172 standard that will enhance or improve the governance and oversight even more of what you can prove and show that your organization is properly taking care of the sensitive information. Most of the organizations we talk to, it's either level 1 or level 2, and a lot are getting swept up in the level 2 because of the controlled unclassified information, even though they're doing a very simple, small thing. So it's just important to understand where you're at and where you fit in that mix, because you can take some interesting, helpful strategies to maybe minimize the impact to your business while still becoming compliant, depending on how pervasive or how much controlled unclassified information you have, what type and where it's stored and how you get it and where you keep it. But nonetheless, those are the kind of the 3 levels. I think of it as foundational, think of it as like what probably most manufacturers will be level 2. And then level 3 gets into if you're doing some really specific defense or some more highly sensitive things.
And then maybe just take a moment to explain who is NIST and what is NIST 800-171 and 172.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, NIST, National Institutes of Standard and Technology, it's a government-sponsored organization that puts in thousands and thousands of hours of research, does the studies, has the experts connected to the educational systems, are connected to professionals and connected to government agencies. And they're basically the organization that creates the standards that says, how does this control work and what are the things you're expected to do? And it actually originally formed a standard for the federal government itself. But then it began forming standards for people that work with the federal government, like subcontractors. And so the 800-171 and 172 are actually a subsection of a much larger federal government policies that the federal agencies are expected to live by and operate by, which is called the 800-53, among many others, but that's kind of the main one that a lot of people know. And the 800-171 and 172 are derivative controls that says, okay, if you're a subcontractor, you don't have to do all these things, but you do have to do these things that are specifically necessary for the supply chain of the federal government.
And when we talk to medium-sized manufacturers today that are kind of getting started with CMMC, just what do we see mostly? I mean, in terms of level of compliance with all 110 controls, what's typical?
There is, maybe it's a stereotype or it's typical. I don't know what the right way to say it is. Most of these organizations that we're talking to are manufacturers that are producing some piece or doing some specific service for a larger contractor that holds the actual contract with the federal government, or a prime contractor, if you will. And the vast majority have been in business for a significant amount of time, somewhere in the 60s, 70s, 80s, many of them. They all have a lot of years behind them. And it's pretty common that when we get in there and we look at their IT systems, that their IT systems are from the 80s, 90s, kind of situation, which means that most have done very, very little and really don't even have the level 1 basics in place. They might have a few things, particularly if they've had some good advice from an outsourced IT provider. But even still, we find that the vast majority, a very high number, aren't even close on level 1 when we first meet them. They've really never felt a strong need to do it. They see, fundamentally, they need to keep their various equipment running. They need to keep their people producing and doing those sorts of things. And and it feels like that the technology side of things is more like viewed as a necessary evil or a low importance thing to take care of, not something to invest in, not something to use as a technology advantage against your competitor in the competition space. It's just seen as a necessary evil and rarely paid attention to well. So we see some pretty, I would call it pretty hairy situations sometimes where their actual fundamental business is reasonably at risk, regardless of whether they're doing CMMC or not, based on the way they're handling their technology.
Right, and I think it's also fair to say that even the prime contractors 10 or 15 years ago also struggled with this level of thoroughness in their cybersecurity. I mean, it's like, I don't know. I've researched it up, and I've heard about some law cases and read into certain things. But like even some of the really big prime contractors, over the past 10 years, really struggled to get to this level of thoroughness and maturity in their cybersecurity practices. And the reality is today that if you're a medium-sized manufacturer or even a small manufacturer and you have access to CUI, you are being held to a similar standard to the prime contractors to a large degree. And that is just, that is just the reality of things. And I think the bad news is that a lot of that does mean for a lot of organizations, there's extra investment that does need to be made in IT, in cybersecurity, in new equipment, in modernization efforts. The good news is I think there's a healthy expectation that these things take time, and that the wheels of commerce need to keep running, and the Defense Department, the Pentagon needs their supply chain to be healthy and moving. But people got to get at it. Procrastinating here does not make much sense.
There's so much to say about that. I mean, a lot of people think like, well, I'll sit down and get a few policy templates and change out the names and submit that and say we're doing this stuff. And, that's, well, you could be falling under the False Claims Act, and I think that's a big issue to be considered and concerned with. I have found that as we've been working with customers, various levels of adoption, they're all on their own path, figuring out their own way. I've noticed that pretty consistently our customers that have embraced this meaningfully moved forward and been able to demonstrate to their prime contractors or potential customers they're working on that they have a really good, meaningful, they're still really enjoying what we would call the first mover benefit, which is they're winning deals today. Because their prime contractor is, or that potential customer is, aware that they're not going to be their problem. So we've seen some of our customers have significant business doubling type of events because they were ahead of the curve on this. That isn't expected to last, but that is kind of where we're at today. Those that jump now are seeing some interesting advantages and are getting some really, really major looks. In fact, we had one customer that was awarded a very sizable multi-million-dollar contract that then was extended even further because they simply couldn't find other suppliers to include that met the requirements that they were looking for. And this was, 4 months ago. And, so I say that because I feel like a lot of folks are trying to say, what's the value and when's the right time? And from my perspective is if you have any interest in increasing your government business, we're seeing customers do that today that have been working on this for a couple of years now.
Right. So let's change gears. So I first of all want to remind everybody who's joined us live, if you've got questions, please drop them into the Q&A tab on GoToWebinar. And then I think now we'll transition into the conversation around what can you do about things? Like what are some practical steps that you and your team can take today to make progress on CMMC? And so let's talk about this first one. You're kind of getting into it a little bit, Carl, in the past couple of minutes, but talk to us about talking with your customers.
Yeah, look, I think ultimately every business, is concerned with having the ability to continue to produce, to continue to grow their business, or at least maintain it at their current size. But most business owners I'm talking to or folks managing the business have a desire to maintain or grow, and grow is where a lot of people's heads at. And so to that end, their customers, the people that will, pay them to do something is where they listen to the most. Not always the federal government and what it wants to say. And so we've noticed that a lot of customers have been able to clarify what they do and don't want to do by having meaningful discussions with their prime contractors. Just bear in mind, we're aware that that's not exactly an easy thing. It's easier said than done to get a meaningful conversation going, because many of these organizations have tens and fifties and hundreds of thousands of employees, and there's all sorts of people's dedicated to things. Sometimes you really have to sort it out and figure out who there cares about this piece or knows about it or can answer your questions. And the reality of it is there's opportunity to be found if you spend time getting to know your customers, getting to know what they're looking for and by what time the adoption is, or just even asking the question, hey, what if we were at this stage? What if we were already looking at level 2 and we were going to be there maybe say in 2023 still? What would that mean, and what opportunities would come? Or as you're looking for potential customers, ask them what the technology profile they're looking for is. We're seeing today that they're now really starting to ask for these CMMC things to be ready to go and well underway. And so that's just, first of all, listen to your customers. They're the ones that are going to want you to bid on contracts, want you to win them, and they will be able to tell you where they're at and what their expectation of timing is.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, fair to say that we've heard that there's a fair amount of diversity between the different prime contractors in terms of their level of organization and the clarity of their communications. Not surprisingly, because you just have different company cultures, you have different supplier management cultures, but there are some of the primes are completely on top of things, clearly communicating, others are not. And so
Right.
Sometimes if your customer may be one of the ones that maybe is a little bit, behind, or is not giving you clear direction, you really need to be proactive and take it in your own hands to really roll up your sleeves, get time with them to really understand how they're looking to implement and enforce and manage these requirements.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, they're the ones that ultimately are typically going to be the difference of whether you get that bid or not. Just know that if you're thinking about CMMC, you're taking a headache off their plate, and it makes you more eligible and more likely to win a contract. And so just keep that conversation going with them and make sure you understand what they're looking for and their timing, and what benefit it would be to them if you were to take this step.
Right, and I think this next step we've kind of unpacked a little bit, but let's kind of just dig in a little further. It's really important to understand whether you have FCI or CUI, and the difference there.
Yeah, I mean, so federal contract information, controlled unclassified information. This isn't like the same as when we talk about top secret or various levels of things like that you might see out there. These are things that are considered not public, though. They're not meant to be distributed, and they can lead to information, or they can even be information that can help one of the adversaries build something or do something that we would rather that they not. And so the federal contract information is simply just the very contracts that you might be bidding on or participating in with a prime contractor, and that's where the minimum requirements are coming from, or the basic hygiene. It's not considered incredibly secret per se, but it's not something that's just meant to be thrown around publicly. And then when it comes to the controlled unclassified information, this is typically the very information you need to do your job as a manufacturer, and it shows up oftentimes as drawings, so that you can use that or things about drawings, or things about parts, or things about components that you're involved with. This could be electronic, it could be a metal process, it could be a treatment process you're doing on the metal. There's any number of things that could be related, but controlled unclassified information is just that. It's meant to be controlled, it's not public, and it is considered sensitive enough that it could be meaningful. Therefore, that's where these requirements come from.
Right. Okay. So let's keep going here, and then Carl, talk to us about, I mean, we talked a little bit about registered provider organizations and C3PAOs. Talk to us a little further, about this.
Yeah, great. Well, so, the CMMC Accreditation Board, or CMMC-AV as it's called, has created a system for organizations that would like to consult and function, or even to do assessments, formal assessments in the CMMC standard space. They've created a system where you can become attested as, knowledgeable, understanding, a viable, correct organization. For instance, if you're going to get some advice or consulting on the CMMC standard, somebody to help you with your IT setup or the compliance, the policy piece, you would want them to be accredited by the CMMC Accreditation Board. And so organizations that have taken the steps to become accredited will be designated a registered practitioner organization. The RPO designation, if you will. And so when you're receiving information about CMMC, these are the folks that are most likely to be able to give you correct information, up to date, know the latest, and know the standards and how they're working. There are also certified third-party assessing organizations. These are the folks that actually do the CMMC assessments and declare or attest to your level of compliance to it. And these organizations typically would not be an RPO. If you will, you could think of it as two sides of the coin. One helps you get your certification, the other assesses if you have done assesses and attests your level of compliance. And so you wouldn't typically have one organization be both things, because that's essentially like being on both sides of the question or the audit, if you will. So it is important, though, that when you're looking for somebody to help you with these important questions, that you get good information, practical information. And so registered practitioner organizations, or RPOs, are going to be great people that can help you, consult with you, and even help you with your self-attestation. And a C3PAO can do the formal one and typically would not help you on the front side, but they come in when you think you're ready for an assessment.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, that was very well explained. Let's keep moving and talk to us about kind of step 4, having a readiness assessment. Talk to us about that process.
Yeah, so look, the beginning process, most of the prime contractors about a year and a half ago started saying, hey, we know this is coming. All we're really thinking the standard is right now is that you need to do an assessment, get a score, register it in the supplier risk system, the SPRS system as we call it. And it's a funny way how it scores, but it's from like negative, I think 205 to positive 110 points that you can get. And that assessment is something that you would probably do well to have done third party, meaning asking your internal team to do that, particularly if they're not a registered practitioner or an RPO organization. You might find that you're not answering these questions correctly, or there might be issues with how you've answered questionnaires that you may not want to be surprised by later. And so you might find that it would be good to employ a third-party organization to review or help you with that assessment. And then, then you can get the score and you can register it. It also, typically, when most folks are doing assessments, they'll usually include a gap analysis and a plan of action, a milestone, which will help you plan out the steps needed to take over whatever period of time you select, 1 year, 2 years, whatever it may be, to get to whatever level that you believe that you want to get to, be it a level 1 or a level 2 or even a level 3. And so that assessment is typically the first stop. You can't, we do sometimes see people say, well, I decided to go turn multi-factor authentication on. So how far am I? Well, unfortunately, that's only one part of one control, but it's like, if you just start doing spot solutions, you might even do a lot of them, but you may not be actually getting to the goal that you intend to do. So it's better to start by identifying everything that you need to know, identifying your current status, and then build your plan from there and then execute it in an order that makes sense. if time and money were no object, maybe you try to do it all at once, but practically it takes a long time. And it's usually for most organizations a significant amount of work. And so getting that initial assessment done correctly with somebody who's expert in it is really your very first step. Then out of that, you have your plan, you know what your budget is, you can set what the timeline you want to operate in, and then you can begin executing through the process of becoming to the level of compliance that you've deemed is appropriate for your organization.
Yeah, you said the budget word, Carl, and I just want to kind of double click on that. I mean, I think that there's a certain level of angst that we run into all the time with leaders and decision makers, because they know in their heart, they're like, oh wow, okay, this is going to require investment. How much? And then everybody always kind of wants to get to the how much. And really, unfortunately, you're jumping the gun there. You really need to step back and understand where you are in terms of your level of compliance. So I think what we're showing here on the screen here is this is an anonymized abstract from a real CMMC assessment we recently performed, and the score for this organization was a -125. And you can see kind of on more of like a 0 to 100%. They've got significant amount of work to be done. And the reality is, until you understand this level of detail in terms of, in this case, a level 2 readiness assessment, what level of compliance are you with the 110 controls? You really can't talk about budget until you've done this level of homework on your situation. And budgeting is also kind of a fluid thing, where it's probably you need to think about it in a multi-year fashion as well. Because this level of compliance, you usually have to plan the work out over a meaningful amount of time.
Yeah, I mean, true. I mean, so, those of us that are curious about numbers, I'll just pause for just a minute and say, just so you know, the way the assessment works when you look at the various controls is, and how they get to the negative and positive scoring is based on the fact that an assessment that is not met produces a negative score, and there's different weightings of it. And then a control that is partially met can either produce a negative or potentially positive or neutral scoring, and then controls that are met produce positive. And so that's how you get to the negative numbers of the various levels. But this goes to illustrate the fact that you needed to know how to properly assess and how to properly score using Department of Defense methodology in order to come up with an accurate score. We see a lot of folks say, well, we have backup, right? So we meet everything that says around backup. That probably is a very simplified and also likely incorrect point of view. All that being said, the cost piece, if you want to know what it's going to cost, you need to get an assessment done and a plan of action done by somebody that can show you the budget over the period of time. When you have done no assessment, how can somebody tell you what it is that your gaps are and then what they cost? So that is a fundamental beginning piece. You must first identify, then you can create your plans, and then you can execute against your plans.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, not to be overly mysterious about it, we do these assessments all the time. And this is really the beginning of any discussion we're having with an organization where they know they need help with CMMC, they know they need help with cybersecurity. This is where we must begin. And it's a 4-week, it's at least a 4-week process. And, from the time somebody decides to do it to the time we can sit down and have a good, thorough conversation and share all the data with the prospective account. So anyway, if this is something that you feel like you need, this is something we definitely supply. Yeah,
well, and I'll add one more level is, most of the time they actually need help with their IT, setting aside CMMC, because they have fundamentals to get to, even those basic things. And so sometimes even their very IT provider or their IT solution is just inadequate. And they'll never get further without reviewing and maybe making different choices there as well.
Yeah, and I think that's another really important thing that I think everybody should kind of take. This should be a hugely positive part of this whole process. Is you can't treat compliance like a checkbox exercise. I mean, the controls that are spelled out in NIST 800-171 and above, they're really healthy cybersecurity best practices. And when you run an organization with good cybersecurity, you're going to have a more productive and stable and predictable IT outcome, which is going to lead to a more productive organization. So these things, it's not just about like jumping through a bunch of hoops and like figuring out what you could check off on the boxes. It's about genuinely improving your cybersecurity posture, its maturity, which is going to lead to better and healthy IT, which is going to make your people more productive and allow you to be a stronger company. So that's a really strong message I think we would like to deliver.
Yeah, there's no doubt that there's complexity to it, but honestly, just starting with the assessment, getting your plan together is a pretty short exercise. It doesn't take a ton of time. In the grand scheme of things, it's not the most costly thing that you could ever do. And then you have all the information you need to know to make a decision.
Right. So let's talk about you come out of an assessment, you know where you stand. Let's say you partner with us, or you partner with another IT service provider, or you have maybe a bigger growing internal IT team. You need a plan of action and milestones, and you need to be managing your system security plan. Talk to us a little bit about what's involved there. And again, we have an abstract here that's anonymized again, but a real 1-year plan, I think or at least an 8-month plan here defined.
Yeah, this would be a snippet of something that's typically like something we provide to show a graphical timeline. Of course, this is just a high-level overview so that an executive or a business owner or a manager can understand the overall plan and what was intended to be done at what stage. But that fundamentally is mostly what a system security plan, or really the plan of action and milestones, is all about, is looking at all of the things that you may or may not want to do, and then figuring out what those various things cost by collecting them into the various projects. Like typically you're not going to go do a project per control. You'll implement some new thing that covers these controls, and then you'll implement some other project that does these ones. And as you go through the process of what makes sense in order to do that, you'll be able to get an estimation of the hardware or software that might be involved, or the outsourced labor it might take to do it, and then the ongoing management of those things that would also be required. And so the plan of action and milestones really is just that. It's mapping out on a timeline in the order that you'd recommend it to be done, noting the controls and then the intended solutions, and then saying the milestone is by saying, when do you intend to have this part done? And so that plan of action milestone document, a lot of times, well, various prime contractors will ask for it. Some just want to know you're doing it. Some want to see it and go through it with you. Different ones respond differently. They also want to see a system security plan, which is, I think you should think of as a policy document that says you're going to follow these controls and at this level, right? It doesn't specifically have to be a system security plan per se. Many primes are good with just any kind of information security policy, but one of the key elements that here, specifically when you get to level 2, is you need to have a policy that says you're going to implement the control, how you're going to do it, and then you're going to need to show how you're auditing that control and that policy. And so there's this cycle that you need to get involved with, and a system security plan can be a good beginning document that you might do to begin documenting your policies around these controls, of which a significant number, but not all of them, are IT related and cybersecurity related, but some of them are around hiring practices. Many of them are around physical control and access to your building. And so there's a lot that you might want in that policy. But the system security plan is a great place to start, and it's a standardized, kind of document that many government agencies know to look for. And the plan of action milestones, similarly, it's like, think of it as a big project plan for how quickly you want to get after these things.
Great. Okay, let's move to the next practical step. And we kind of hinted at this one a little bit earlier in the discussion, but talk to us about thinking about this offensively rather than defensively.
Yeah, well, so we have a webinar posted on our website. It looks like that's a screenshot of it here from one of our customers in the Arizona market. And basically, tells a pretty compelling story about their interactions with prime contractors, and going from, being told they couldn't participate on contracts to being awarded pretty significant contracts. And a lot of it, one of the major critical pieces that helped them become on the list of people they would consider was the proactive things that they did to get ahead of this. We meaningfully started with them ironically, is you think of timing, like January of 2020. And so, you know, some of the 2020 years was a little weird for everybody, right? But by 21, we were meaningfully getting after it. And by, you know, earlier this year in the April-May timeframe, we were closing up all the major pieces after, you know, a couple years of working through this. And you know, you can watch the webinar yourself to hear the customer speak about it. It's made a meaningful impact, and their perspective has been that the money was well spent to get there, although it was not minor for them. It's going to be different for everybody, but they've already, you know, for me as a business owner, I always look at it, if I spend $1, but I get back 2, or I get back 3, or I get back 5, it's always worth it. And so I think there's something to be considered about whether that makes sense, rather than wait to the spot where you're forced to and kind of be with the crowd and not distinguish. They're standing themselves out amongst the crowd by being ahead of this.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that, I mean, it has to be a return on investment type conversation. I mean, I think it's pretty fair to say sometimes we'll talk to a manufacturer that maybe only has 5% of their business in defense. And sometimes the conversation is like, well, maybe this level of investment and modernization is not in order, and we just like exit that business because it's not a meaningful part of our business.
Yeah, there are times when that makes sense, and once you see the numbers, you can correctly, you know, do the math to see if it makes sense. You know.
Right. So it's definitely think about it as a business conversation, return on investment conversation, but I think really a competitive differentiation opportunity, because I mean, you can tune in to go to SnapTech's YouTube channel and listen on demand to the webinar we did with Genuine Machine, and they clearly have used it as a competitive differentiator by getting after this early, really modernizing their infrastructure, modernizing their approach to IT and cybersecurity. They are winning more than their fair share of business from contracts now because the primes know they're ready to go. I mean, they are basically, I think at this point, all 110 controls are implemented, and now we're in a mode of maintaining their infrastructure and their policies and procedures at an extremely high level. And so that just puts them in the pole position on new contracts. Because the primes are under a legal obligation with the federal government to work with suppliers that are compliant. And so it's really, I think everybody should be thinking about, you know, play offense or exit. You know, like playing purely defense on this is not a really smart idea.
Yeah, and there's interesting strategies, like sometimes depending on what information you have, how it comes and how you need to use it, you might be able to produce enclaves or subsections of your network that allows you to still meaningfully and correctly meet the standards, but maybe not have to invest as much as you imagine. It's hard to say that whether that's a practicality. Usually our assessment's going to, or any assessment that somebody does correctly is going to you know, expose those kind of options when you get into the planning phase of how you would move forward. But you know, look, it's coming. You know, when everybody else is forced to do it, it will be less of a differentiator and maybe less easy to turn into wins so much as saves to keep current customers. And so, you know, are you trying to just save current customers, or perhaps maybe you could get into more contracts or more opportunities if you took it that way? You know, it's always about the business strategy, and I know you know everybody knows their own customers. That's why I say just talk to your customers. They'll let you know what they're gonna expect. And if you endeavor to go look for new customers or get into more contracts, I think that anybody of us can recognize that these things are coming, and some are already seeing it today, where they really want you to be further along than just getting started.
Okay, and then let's talk a little bit about working with an IT service provider or MSP. I mean, not every organization, this is how they do it today, or maybe they have some outsourced relationship, but maybe that provider may or may not have the level of expertise in CMMC to get people where they need to be. So
yeah, a lot of our customers that we help with the CMMC question, we work with their current managed IT provider, and many of them haven't even considered that their IT provider might be a problem for them getting their attestation on the controls because of the way the IT provider behaves or doesn't behave, if you will. And so it's an interesting point of view to be in. There are a few of us managed IT providers who are both doing IT services and are knowledgeable and registered provider organizations and can help. But the vast majority are not. And because of that, there could be a real risk involved in that. And so when you're looking for a managed IT provider, if you're thinking of the CMMC thing, you might need to leverage that managed IT provider or internal IT resources and a registered provider organization to help with just the CMMC part. So really all those things come into play simultaneously. There are a few of us that are a bit of a one-stop shop for you in that regard, but the vast majority are not. And so just be aware that you may need to leverage an IT service provider, but you also may need to have on top a CMMC, a registered provider organization, or simply go to one that can do both.
Yeah, and I think that what we're showing here on this slide is the normal journey when we work with a new client. In terms of how we would traditionally engage them and work with them to evolve and modernize what they're doing, and then provide ongoing support. So, I mean, there's a huge variety in terms of ways in which organizations are managing IT today. Sometimes we come across an account that has a scrappy internal team where there's maybe a handful of folks who are managing IT internally, but they've outgrown that situation. They're ready not only to confront the CMMC topic, but they're ready to actually leverage outsourced IT as a way to kind of turbocharge what they're doing and get them to that next level, because it's a far more efficient way of doing it. Other times go ahead.
I was to say, I mean, at the most fundamental level, you the provider, the manufacturer, you're the ones out there doing the hard work, getting this done. And your IT provider should be a guide for you. They should be helping you get there, helping you get to what you and your employees need. And you want to pick smart. You want to pick the kind of provider that can be savvy to this and also can help you through the journey and guide you and really help you be an excellent manufacturing organization that can get out there and grow at the speed that you want to and reach your goals.
All right. Okay, well, with that, I want to invite our audience to continue to submit questions. Just use the GoToWebinar tab. We've got a couple more minutes to go for some questions. Let me just grab one right away. So Randy asks, when do companies need to be compliant? So I don't think we talked about timeline much, so that's a good one.
Oh, well, so, I'd say there's two answers, and it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, I suppose. I mean, we're talking May of 24 is the current stated. It has changed in the past. I think the initial writing of CMMC, it was going to be in 2020. And then when the COVID situation happened, like everything went, well, let's throw it up. And then they came out with the revision, and then the dates moved, and they moved again. I don't know when they're going to be, but the current is May of 24. That being said, we're already seeing customers that are being told no on bidding on certain projects because they're not far enough along. And so I think your customers are your number one guide, or your prospective customers, because at this point, it's whatever they're going to require you to do in order to bid and participate. That being said, the overall standard is currently expected to be enforceable as of May of 24. And to be perfectly frank, that's not very far away in the terms of getting after this. Most companies we've seen, it's taken them 1 to 3 years to be able to meet the controls they need to.
And I guess just a follow-on question. 1 to 3 years. I mean, why that long? I mean, give us some flavor of like where are the big rocks that need to be attacked, in a project like that?
Well, usually there's no meaningful documentation in place, and so it can take some time to put that together. That's usually 60 to 100 pages worth of writing that needs to be done and applied to your business in a unique and in a meaningful way that you actually live by. Then typically there's significant IT practices that need to be changed or updated or improved. and those take time to accomplish, and also typically they carry an expense that most people they need to spread that cost out over time. And so it's typically a function of budget and how quickly you can move through it. It's not the kind of thing, though, that you could just say, hey, I've got all the money in the world, get it done in 3 months. It still takes time to simply go through the change, document it, and go after it. And then producing the reports and the audits that come to show and demonstrate the execution of the control. So it's just one of these things that just simply can't be done instantly or overnight or even in a few months. Even for the smallest organization, just simply takes time.
Yeah, and I think an important thing that folks need to realize is that cybersecurity is not like waving a magic wand. I mean, it's really, cybersecurity practices require like implementation and cultural change. And that's why it's not just like an overnight thing, because you really have to change the behavior of how your workforce interacts with their IT systems, how they do processes. And so there's all this change has to happen internally, because it's not just about like putting in new switches or putting in some new software technology to monitor something. It really requires a lot of like policy changes, which if followed, require procedure changes and actual like workflow changes in how you actually run your business. And so that's what makes it take time.
Training your staff. It's a meaningful, additional things done in IT that maybe you hadn't seen value in before, but now are part of the requirement to do. And then it comes down to individual behavior and understanding all the way to anybody that interacts with your IT, not just a couple of people or even just your IT staff or your IT provider. It really goes beyond that, and that just takes time and education and some time spent working through it.
Right. Okay, well, I think that I don't see any other questions. What I do want to invite our audience, whether you're listening live or you see this on demand later, if you have follow-up questions, reach out to us. Go to the SnapTech website, ask us to reach out to you, or if you're already engaged with one of our colleagues, ask additional questions. We're more than happy one-on-one to hop on one-on-one conversations to explore these topics. And hopefully you learned from today that we have the internal expertise to really help organizations move the ball ahead on CMMC specifically.
I can tell you real quick, Ted, before you get to the next thing, I know this is a big topic. I know it's got a lot of people concerned and there's a lot of unknowns. I think the best thing you can do is work on the assessment piece to start getting rid of unknowns to make them known, so you really know what you are or not dealing with. And it may not be near as complicated or as bad as you're thinking. It may be a lot more attainable, particularly when you get involved with people that really know how to do this and apply this in a practical way, because I think that you can really get spun up by people that just don't know how to apply this in a practical way to your business, and you can overdo it. And you don't want to do too much, and you don't want to do too little. That's where the expertise comes in. So, I just highly encourage people to get to answering those unknown questions. You might be surprised at what the effort is or isn't, maybe positively, maybe negatively, but nonetheless, there's probably some insights to be gained that would really help you make the decision.
Okay, with that, we're just about to, it's time to wrap things up. I want to invite everybody, if you enjoyed today's webinar, join us on a future monthly webinar. Next month, we're going to be talking about 7 steps to securing remote workers. So less of a vertical conversation, more of a horizontal concern, because all organizations are learning how to manage a remote workforce and to do so in a secure fashion. So tune in for next month's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you there. And with that, Carl, I want to thank you for all of the expertise and advice you supplied on today's webinar.
Thank you, Ted. Appreciate it. Glad to be here. And thank you for those that listened. And yeah, reach out. We're happy to have a conversation if you have any follow-up questions.
Okay. And thanks everybody for joining us live, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you. Take care now.